Welcome to ODI Bites, a series of events that will address critical global challenges with key experts. In this episode, we explore decolonising development, rethinking research practices to make an impact in the communities we operate to elevate future voices. We hear from Robtel Neajai Pailey, Assistant Professor in International Social and Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Carmen Leon-Himmelstine, Senior Research Officer, ODI. What are the main issues with the way development research is produced?
Development research suffers from a white gaze problem. What do I mean by that? We often assume implicitly or explicitly that Western whiteness and modernity are the primary signifiers of progress, against which all others are deemed deviant, inferior, incomplete. Yet, while development is structured along hierarchies of race and place, there are glaring silences on race and racism in development scholarship, policy, and practice. Now, producing development research has traditionally been about traveling to places far and wide in the so-called global South, collecting data, analyzing it, making grand theories and observations about how systems work or don't work in these locales, and then publishing findings in outlets based in the so-called global North. Very few of us in the discipline or sector actually share our findings with and ask for critique from the institutions, the individuals, and the communities we consult during data collection. Now, even in instances where collaborations exist between scholars and researchers in the so-called South and North, Northern institutions and Northern-based scholars tend to set research agendas and questions, determine how resources will be allocated, and control the purse strings. This produces power imbalances and calls into question the ethics of knowledge production and whose knowledge is actually valued. Now, development research also exists in a Euro-American linguistic prison, to use the phrase of Kenyan novelist and scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Not only do we reproduce racist tropes about the so-called global South, but we also do so in language in large measure in colonial languages, such as English or French, Spanish, or German. Now, I'd like to see us anthropologize the West, as some critical anthropologists have challenged us to do, in languages such as Gikuyu, Hausa, Mandarin, Hindi, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to see us dissect and publish on the dysfunctional nature of power in the so-called global North and how it actually impacts people, policies, and practices in the so-called global South.
The main issue for me is that the relationship between the so-called global North and the global South is unequal, and this is reflected in every single stage of the research cycle. So, for example, the research agenda is led by global North funders and researchers who decide what topics are worth researching and why some customs, traditions, or ways of living in the global South are problematic and why we need to fix them. And development research is itself extractive and hierarchical, which means that researchers in the global North, they arrive to the global South, they greet participants, they ask them very intimate questions about their lives, and then they leave whenever they feel like it, without not necessarily sharing the findings or the main lessons of the research with participants. And we have also continued to use research methods in the global North that are not necessarily very different from before. So, for example, global North researchers, we use in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, key informants interviews, and so on. And this is very comfortable for the global North researcher because there is not much trial and error and there is not much innovation. But other approaches which involve research partners and participants in the design of the research, such as participatory and transformative methods, these are rarely used. And also, global North institutions and researchers decide what is rich, high quality, rigorous research, and what a good report or journal article looks like before publication. And at the same time, publications in the local language are not widely read because top journals are not in English. So, look, the question that I would like to pose is, are we properly evaluating and valuing research that is locally produced and globally relevant? And the answer is that probably not, because at the moment, whiteness and location in the global North symbolize authority, expertise, and knowledge, echoing what Robtel just described as the white gaze of development. And this is what we need to shift.
Why must we consider decolonisation processes?
Decolonization processes compel us to address the legacies of slavery, of colonialism, imperialism, neoliberalism, and how they manifest in our contemporary experiences of the world. In decolonizing development, for instance, we interrogate poverty, power, and privilege, where they are situated, why, and how this actually came to be so. Decolonization is about rupture, as argued by Martinican philosopher Frantz Fanon of Black skin, white mass fame. It is not about maintaining the status quo. It is not about maintaining the status quo at all. This rupture can take place in many forms, in different levels, and must occur in and outside the ivory tower. Now, at the level of scholarship, decolonization demands epistemic justice. In this sphere, we are forced to question who produces knowledge, what knowledge is produced, whose agenda knowledge serves, how we produce and disseminate knowledge. We are forced to mine dominant theories and methodologies for colonial hangups, critique, and challenge. We are encouraged to come up with emancipatory, horizontal, bottom-up theories of socioeconomic change and transformation. We are challenged to actively populate our reading lists, our references, our citations, and our faculty rosters, as well as editorial boards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with critical voices from the so-called Global South. We are forced to adopt unconventional pedagogies and value lived experience as an important site of knowledge production. Now, at the level of policy, decolonization demands institutional change. Here, we must forego formal and informal rules, regulations, conventions, and protocols that reproduce racist, sexist, and classist hierarchies. At the level of practice, decolonization demands procedural justice. We are forced to incorporate the perspectives of people who have been deliberately and systematically left out of decision-making. This requires changing hiring practices and decoupling maleness from power, as well as whiteness from power. It involves decentering Euro-American mores and folkways. Decolonization processes can only be revolutionary if they bring about structural reforms at all of these levels.
For me, we must consider decolonization processes for different reasons, and one of them is that if we ignore the roots of existing inequalities between researchers and practitioners from the so-called global north and the global south, we will hardly be able to build equal partnerships. And part of the roots of these inequalities are identified by Ugandan scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, and he describes how European researchers, and particularly anthropologists, were an important instrument to produce ethnographic data knowledge that was needed to rule over the native. So we even ignored that part of the origins of development research and practice are racist and are colonial. And if we fail to acknowledge these roots, we won't be able to make any progress in decolonizing development. And also we must consider processes of decolonization in order to move beyond colonial assumptions of what development is and how it can be achieved. And this won't happen until we truly listen to the lives and experiences of research participants and understand how people with different worldviews may envision important notions that we use in development, such as well-being, social mobility, human capital, quality of life, and so on. At the moment, only those constructed by the global north are worth pursuing, but what local populations consider important and worth achieving is often ignored. And also, we need to engage in decolonization so that we understand and address the roots of problems that we want to solve in development. So, for example, issues such as HIV/AIDS, poverty, gender inequality, corruption, and so on have their roots in very important historical processes such as imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. So, us as researchers, we cannot really come up with solutions and policy recommendations if we ignore history, and particularly the legacies of colonialism in the so-called global south.
What would a reimagined development sector look like? How can we produce research which is impactful whilst being authentic, respectful, and relevant?
A reimagined development sector is one in which we tackle inequalities head-on within and between countries and regions of the world through structural transformation of the global economy. This would need to happen at macro, meso, and micro levels. It would involve no strings attached debt cancellation for countries that have suffered from misguided structural adjustment policies. It would involve doing away with aid in favor of equitable global trade rules, charging countries in the global north a carbon tax, paying so-called local development actors well, and placing people of color, women, and the poor at the center of decision-making. In this reimagined sector, reparative justice would be the order of the day, in which the descendants of slaves would receive their 40 acres and a mule, in which formerly colonized people, spaces, and places would be compensated for the devastating losses they incurred during colonial extraction and continue to incur as a result of neoliberalism. In this reimagined sector, the so-called global South would control the levers of power over development, pushing those with unearned privilege to the margins. In a reimagined development sector, context would drive policymaking and practice, rather than adopting one-size-fits-all approaches to achieving socioeconomic change. This would force us to consult endogenous development actors, incorporate their inputs, and most importantly, explicitly acknowledge their contributions. In order to produce impactful and relevant research, we must come up with a completely different lexicon for describing people, places, and processes. We must do away with racist colonial binaries such as global North versus global South, developing versus developed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We must cite, teach, engage with radical thinkers from the so-called global South, whose voices have been deliberately silenced and or preferably unheard, to quote Indian author and activist Arundhati Roy. We must change our institutional approaches to research while respecting and upholding people's dignity, no matter where they happen to reside.
For me, reimagined development sector is that which rebels against development as we know it, and one that uses research and programming as a process of reparation to the global South. And in terms of how we can produce research that is impactful, respectful, and relevant, I would say that we need to understand development research as a process that places the voices and epistemologies of people from the global South in the center. And as Robtel mentioned, this involves reviewing our literature, references, the staff of the institutions where we work, and so on, in a way that global South professionals are included. And this is also an ongoing process that involves challenging oneself, of learning and unlearning about what development is. And at the end, this is going to help us to understand other approaches of knowing the world. And also, respectful and authentic research is that which creates a collaborative and more equitable space between researchers from the so-called global North and South and participants. And there are ways to achieve this. For example, nominating the global South researcher as principal investigator, giving global South researchers the opportunity to own and lead on their research rather than being just the research assistant of the global North researcher. And in case of participants, to reposition them from objects of research into questionnaires, examiners, theorists of our subject of research, communication, and so on. And research should be impact-oriented to stay relevant. And to be impactful for me, constant communication and learning needs to take place between donors, researchers, participants, and other stakeholders. So they need to sit together and discuss along the process. And we will need to consider additional time and costs, most probably, but these are necessarily if we want findings to be useful and impactful.
Final thoughts.
Mainstreaming race as an anti-racist agenda for development is more important now than I would say ever before, as we've seen from the surge of protests across the globe following the brutal murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And from the data that Black and Brown people have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, we know that people of color experience limited statehood, material deprivation, grinding poverty, and inequality in the so-called global North at alarming rates, in the same way that they do in the so-called global South. This is an argument that Amartya Sen makes in his really important seminal text, Development as Freedom. Analyzing race forces us to see development as a global challenge, not solely a predicament of the so-called global South.
As Robtel mentions, COVID-19 shows us that the status quo as we know it is the problem, and also that one-size-fits-all solutions are not going to solve current social and economic inequalities. And we also need to address race and racism, since they are still taboo in development, and even though race shapes the distribution of resources and structures of power, including in development. So I would invite scholars and practitioners in the sector to reflect on their positionality and their privilege, and to support the efforts from the Global South to lead on their own development.
Thank you for tuning into ODI Bites. Find out more on odi.org/events.